What would you like for your lower third?
Writer, artist, and then we'll name title, Superman for sure, Thor, Captain America, Justice League, Booster Gold, say.
Any of those would be...
Any of those or all of them. Yeah. If it'll fit. Okay. I've done a lot. Why did Superman have to die? One of the challenges in writing Superman is not just telling a story. It's about adding to the tapestry of Superman's history and the magnificent group of characters and everything that it had developed around him over, a number of years. Superman first appeared in 1938. So in 1991, as we started to plan the idea of a death of Superman, it was really driven by the idea of what can we say about Superman? So for example, we had toyed around with the idea earlier once or twice, never really got anywhere with it. And one of the things that would happen is our editor, who was Mike Carlin, would say, you can't just kill Superman. Why do you want to kill Superman? When someone dies, that's really when we reflect on who they were. That's when we kind of talk about their importance to us, whether it's someone who was close to us, whether it was a famous individual, maybe an actor, a writer, who knows, a politician. And as we started to talk about the potential death of Superman, we really talked about what would happen if you take Superman out of the DC universe. What happens with Batman, the Justice League, Perry White, Lois Lane, his parents, and everybody else. So we talked a lot about a world without Superman. What kind of funeral would he get? How would he be remembered by normal people in the DC universe? And we got so interested in that and realized we could make some, I think, a profound statement about who Superman was, that we concentrated on that. And then we started to work back and say, okay, if we did kill Superman, who would do it? How would he die? How would he die? And so it was really a focus on what do we say about the character of Superman? I think the principal character in comics, with his removal, and then how do we get there? When we made the decision to kill Superman and we mapped out the story, so for example, Superman died in Superman 75. Then we had 2 months worth of stories coming out after that, which told the story of Superman's funeral, the world adjusting to the idea that their greatest hero had died, people coming to grips with the loss of that great hero, including those who knew and loved him, whether it was Lois Lane or his parents, Ma and Pa Kent. And after that, we stopped publishing Superman comics. And so even at that time, when we planned out the death of Superman story, we did not know exactly how he would come back, when he would come back, or anything else. We just knew that we were going to, burn ourselves out doing the death of Superman, and then said, yeah, but at the end, we're going to get a break. But when we made that decision, there were no absolute plans by any means on how or when we would do it. One of the things that happens is we have this ordering cycle in comics where distributors at that time would put out catalogs, and there were multiple distributors saying, and this is how retailers would order the comics for their stores. So, the death of Superman happened in November of 1992, came out like mid-November 1992, but the stories were solicited, I want to say, August of that year. So people already started to see there's something coming here, and, we started to get a bit of attention that way. But it wasn't until the book actually came out where it was covered on all the major newscasts, be it in by local TV stations, in local markets, or national TV news, columns put out in major newspapers that said, if they're killing Superman, what does that say about us as a society? That kind of thing. And it just got so big in a broken way, we never could have anticipated. And so there were a lot of different reactions, and it was a wild ride.
What about his return?
The return of Superman was interesting in this sense, and it was kind of the very early days of the internet. And I remember seeing, speculation on the internet that said, yes, of course they're bringing Superman back. And I know someone who knows someone, and I know how they're going to do it. And I'd see these rumors about how Superman was coming back. And I would just say, we don't have a plan. We don't know how we're bringing Superman back. And, some of us would talk about it a little bit, but we had no definitive idea. And so as we did plan the return, we came up with this idea that 4 different characters would essentially show up, all claiming to be Superman, somehow brought back to life, reincarnated, something. And I think that was a secret that we were able to keep until everybody saw the books and read them and we're kind of like, whoa, where did this come from? In this day and age, if the internet existed then the way it does now, I don't think we ever could have kept that a secret. But we were able to do it. It took the market by surprise, and it continued the adventure and continued this idea that Superman didn't just show up all of a sudden and say, "Hi, I'm back." It was this continual adventure where one story took us to the next, and we were then able to kind of keep that sense of awe and wonder that is so important to Superman comics going. During my time at DC, and my first work appeared there, I think, in early 1982, certainly we saw the evolution of the direct market. Comic publishers had started to sell to the direct market, of course, but I don't think anyone had quite tried any direct-only titles yet. It was shortly after I would have gotten in that I think Marvel tried Dazzler, maybe, as a direct-only title. In other words, it was not available on the newsstand. DC followed shortly thereafter with Firestorm as a title that I think was appearing only in the direct market. So they were experimenting with it as the market evolved. And certainly throughout the 80s and into the early 90s, the amount of comic stores continued to grow. Sales in the direct market continued to grow. And that was something that the companies and publishers both were adjusting to and at the same time cultivating. If the publishers were saying, okay, we now have this thing called the direct market and we give them direct market only books, does that bring more people into the stores? And I think we were taking what had been casual readers who were picking up, well, I shouldn't say casual, we were picking up readers who were sometimes challenged to find all the issues they wanted on the newsstand and bringing them into the stores for a sense of community where they knew that comic store would likely have every issue of Popsicle Man or whoever they were reading available at any time. And that really helped, I think, build that idea of the direct store and what it meant to the community. I think the great things, well, there are several things that I think comic book stores can provide to the community when they're really working well. And one is the customers at these stores all get to know one another some way, somehow. A good store will have, like various events, signings, whatever. Come out and buy, this book is, issue 1 is coming out on this day. Come out, we'll have a little party and a celebration for it, something like that. But the customer base, they all get to know one another, and some of them become friends, and they see each other at the stores, and it builds that sense of community. The store is always going to have the product that they want, and I think that's the big thing. What I think is also important is a store will often be owned or managed by someone who says, I really know our customer base. I know our individual readers, and so when, Dan comes into the store, they'll say, you might not have ordered this title, but I know what you read. I think you would like this. Give it a try. And so they build that idea of suggesting product to their customer base. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but that's all part of that exchange and that sense of community that develops where people, customers, they know they can get the product they want. But what's also nice about it is that retailer can also point them in new directions, and they appreciate that. It's always interesting to me in the owners that I have known who take that time to get to know their customers. Or, even if it goes so far as, I think almost all stores do this, where they have different picks by the staff. So you walk in and you're looking at the rack of new comics, and this is Mark's pick, and this is Kevin's pick, and this is, Jennifer's pick, whatever. And you go through and you say, well, I like what she likes, so I'll give that one a try. So even if it's that, and that's all part of building what they want. And then I think there's also this. A lot of retailers do conventions. And if there is a particular convention that, you can't get to, you can say to your retailer, well, if you're there and can find a copy of, the ever famous Popsicle Man again, issue 367, can you pick that up for me? And that's sort of that extension service that I think good stores can provide as well. If we go back and look at, how did comic book stores start and what were they in the beginning? They were often, small places, little hole in the wall, maybe somewhat downtrodden neighborhoods, not like crime infested or anything, but just, they weren't high rent districts that these stores inhabited. None of them had enough room to show their product, right? Some of them probably weren't as welcoming to women and certainly moms as they could have been, in the way they displayed their product. Here's the normal superhero stuff right next to the adult stuff, whatever it might be, things like that. But I think as things evolved and stores became, I hate to use this phraseology, but I'm going to have to, more real business aware type of places, that they then started to realize the great advantages of trying to appeal to more and more people instead of just, fanboy central. And I think they were able to grow out of that and start to offer different product and start to offer a wider range of product and start to pull in a wider range of customers. For the longest time, I think in the history of comics, there had always been the attitude that we get readers and they hang with us for, 4 years or whatever. And it's a kid that starts reading when he's like 9 years old and he gives it up when he's 12, something like that, that it was a more casual readership base. And over time, they became aware of the idea, when I say they, I mean publishers, that people weren't necessarily giving up the books or this idea of reading comics. And that as even basic superhero comics began to adjust a bit to that older readership and take on some more mature themes, that there were so obviously readers who would follow that. But I think there was also this attitude, no one is going to start reading comics when they're 18 years old or 20 years old as a college kid. And as people started to say, that might work out, and they started to create product for that. And I think this is one of the great victories of Vertigo, which was started by DC Comics, is that, yes, they did start to find out that comics were not totally impenetrable to those who didn't start reading when they were 9 years old. That if they created product that might be of interest to someone who was a college student, someone in their 20s or older, I'm not, just targeting college students, but that people might actually start reading comics when they were older, than that 9-year-old kid, and start to develop interest in comics as an art form that very much concentrated on those older themes. And those older themes could appear in books that did not have to be superhero books. They could be anything. They could be mystery. They could be horror. They could just, you could run the gamut. And then as that idea opened up, that we can create product for a much wider range of people, then the ideas that went into that product were there as well. And so this is what I talked about earlier. In one sense, there's a recognition of a market, while at the same time that you cultivate that market. One of the things I have found over the years is that when I think back to what comic stores say were in 1980, say the 1980s, that to me a lot of the stores all felt the same. And you could walk in one comic store in one city and see the exact same kind of comic store in almost every city. What I have seen is what I think of as a comic store has changed drastically in that time. And I see stores that more reflect the communities they might be in. And by community, I can say neighborhood, or I could say city, and so consequently, those who own those stores, they know their customer base, right? And so they will handle product that I think more reflects what is within that community. Certainly, what I see in every store that I go into is a much more diverse audience than I would have seen, say, in the early 1980s. I see far more women buying comics than I did then as customers. Where, it used to be back then, you'd see some women here and there who would come in and buy comics. Most of the women you saw were probably mothers who were bringing in their kids to buy comics. It was very rare to see a woman working in a comic book store. That is certainly no longer the case. And, I think that is one of the things that has changed drastically over the years. And so what I do see is, like, if a good store owner says, I am going to locate my shop in this incredibly diverse neighborhood in a city, the product reflects that. I think if you go to a suburban store, that suburb might reflect whatever that is. But it's still going to be a very diverse product. It's going to be a product that I think is diverse in terms of gender, in terms of race, certainly in terms of ages. Because obviously there's going to be just as much stuff for an older reader as there is for someone who's, say, 14. And I think the way that moves now and that diversity within that store, again, helps drive what creators are doing to go into those markets. When I think back to the material that got me excited as a reader, when I was, say, that 9-year-old kid, there is less of that product available now. And I think we've become very much an industry where even within the superhero genre, stories tend to be, say, 6 issues long. And that's because that will fit a trade paperback format that is going to come out later, for a second life. And we could probably do, in my estimation, a much better job of just creating, fun, dynamic, entry point stuff. And by entry point, I don't necessarily mean, 6-year-olds where everything is drawn in an animated style, because I think as a kid, I was always drawn toward the stuff that was a little bit harder to understand. Because you knew, it's like, even if you were 12 and you sensed that that book appealed to 15-year-olds, well, then I'm pretty cool if I'm reading that, right? So I think we need to find a bit more of that pulse where we can do a better job of building for younger readers, entry point readers, get them excited about the characters and the adventure, because that's still, I think, what drives their imagination, and then go from there. Any discussion along the line of literacy and what people will say to me is a little more nuanced than that. And I think often what it is, and let's use Death of Superman as an example, I have never done a convention or a signing or anything else where I don't have, and I do a lot of these things, where I don't have at least 2 people, and usually more, come up to me and say, the Death of Superman is what got me into comics. And it is driven a lot of different ways. I have a number of people who will say, my dad let me skip school that day so he could take me to the comic store and buy Superman 75. Or they'll say, my dad stopped on the way home from work and stood in line for 3 hours in the driving rain to get me this comic and gave it to me for Christmas. Or, I get so much of that I look back on. And I think we had a story that was readable and understandable and accessible to people who had not read comics before. Ultimately, I think that is part of what this sense of literacy and how comics can help derives from. That I take a lot of satisfaction in knowing that, somewhere there is a parent who got his 8-year-old son or daughter the Death of Superman, and maybe it was the individual comic, maybe it was the trade paperback, which was out by Christmas of '92, and they read it, and it stimulated that sense of imagination, and it got them into this idea of reading and reading regularly. And then that's where that sense of literacy grows from. Not everyone is necessarily going to want to read a prose novel. I think when I was a kid, I was fascinated by the marriage of words and illustrations. I think back to that as what appeared in comics. I also think back to that as books where they would just have like a single plate illustration every chapter. That always, to me, made that story more interesting. And the illustration is something I might look at and say, well, how did they do that? And, obviously I was interested in art at a young age, but it helped stimulate that interest for me. And I also know that there were times when reading comics, I would stumble across a word that I didn't necessarily know. For me, one of the classics is Superman. When I first read the word invulnerable, I did not know what that meant. But what I then discovered is once, and I think I probably asked my mom or dad and found out the answer to that one. But then by the time I was in school the next day or whatever, no one else as a second grader knew what that word meant either, but by God, I did, thanks to comics. And that's all part of it. And I do think we as an industry and as an art form do play a role in stimulating that sense of wonder and imagination that is key to wanting to read.
With the culture being everywhere, that there's a tiny geeky gatekeeper in the back of my head from my youth, that the stigma of comics was kind of the what am I trying to say, the gauntlet that you had to endure.
Right.
Fandom.
Yep.
And that's removed now, and
That,
in
yes.
a beautiful way. We're all thankful for it, but I still feel like some of the older guard are kind of yeah, but I mean, no one beat you up for reading Superman or.
No, I know exactly what you mean. With everything that has happened over the past 15, 20 years as comics, or I should say comic characters, the IP has shown up in movies and television, and video games are also a huge component of this, that there is this idea with some people that their clubhouse door got kicked in, right? That, this secret little world that we have that we used to get castigated and ridiculed for, now everybody is in on it. And, I can't just sit here in my tree fort anymore and just enjoy my time by myself reading comics with my tight buds. Now there are more people who are part of the discussion. I think that has gone away or is still in the process of going away. But at first, yeah, I think there was that sense out there well, you're not buying comics. You can't have an opinion on who Iron Man is. And yeah, I think that's disappearing. And I think that's a good thing. Again, it shows how while comics might not necessarily be having as much an influence on that the movies are in terms of opening up that audience that's out there.